You're now listening to The Bryan Callen Show, rated the #1 podcast of all time.
Of all time. Make sure you're ready, because this is the podcast where you are guaranteed to learn virtually everything. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Go to audiblepodcast.com/BCS. Stands for The Bryan Callen Show. Get your free download. I use Audible all the time, actually, because I drive so much in LA. But I think it's a great way to get a lot of books read. I think people read books too quickly. And, I'm friends with a novelist who took 10 years to write his book. The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, W-A-O, by Juno Diaz is must listening to. You have to listen to it because it's incredible. So that's my recommendation for the book to listen to on Audible. Reading makes the difference, especially the right books. And if you haven't noticed, I have a lot of great authors on The Bryan Callen Show, and I recommend many of the books that they have written. Not the least of which is Salt and Cod by Mark Kurlansky. Don't forget to go to the audiblepodcast.com/BCS, The Bryan Callen Show, for your free download. All right, everybody, this is The Bryan Callen Show, and I am very excited, and I give my partner in crime here, Hunter Mott's, credit for getting Mark Kurlansky. And if you guys don't know who he is, people are always asking me what to read and stuff. I haven't read all of Mark's books because, well, he's written 25 of them, okay? Most famously, Cod and Salt. And I just, before I have Mark speak, I just got to say, Mark's the kind of guy who he came up with these sort of micro histories, and as a result, there are a lot of other people that have copied his style. There are a lot of other people now are coming up with books like For Fish and things like that, where they take a commodity and they basically show how it has affected our history and how one commodity creates this ripple effect. And so, Mark Kurlansky, welcome to the Bryan Callen Show. Very excited to have you here.
Glad to be here.
And my friend, you've written 25 books. I don't know how you're that prolific. Let's start with how do you do that? How do you allocate your time, and how do you choose your subject matter? It's crazy.
Well, I write every day. Mm-hmm. I write for a lot of hours every day.
Yeah.
It's a job, you know.
Yeah, but you're very gutsy, Mark, and I'll tell you why. This is my point of view. You cast certain commodities, let's say salt, let's say cod, as main characters, and then you weave this wonderful tale, and you learn so much about history and so much about even human nature and why things happen. You know,
it kind of evolves the other way around. I mean, what I start by looking for a great story. Mm. That's what's most important to me. I am at heart a storyteller, and a book like Cod, I didn't start by saying, "Oh, this is a commodity that can tell us a lot" or something. I started by saying, "There's a really great story here." Mm-hmm. And not all of my books are about commodities, but I hope that all of my books are good stories.
Well, they are good stories. First of all, it's really fun and accessible reading. And the one thing that people always say, what kind of history should I read and stuff? Is usually young people. You make it so accessible, you make it so fun. But what's very interesting about you is that you have two very different interests. It seems to me. You write about 1968. You talk about how important 1968 is as a movement, as a year. And so you kind of, your interests are in social protest, in nonviolent social protest. And then you've got this whole other sort of interest, which is, here's how cod, the fish cod, or the stone we eat, salt, has changed the world. Can you talk a little bit about how you connect the two, and if you do, in fact?
Well, I probably have more than two interests.
Well, you don't write 25 books with only two interests, but I mean, they're just.
But those are two. I've always been very interested in food, as an anthropological source, what food tells us about society and what it tells us about history. I'm really not the guy you want to get restaurant recommendations from.
Why is that? You're so eclectic in your interest, or what?
I just don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. I'm working all the time.
Right. So you're not really a foodie.
Yeah.
Not really, although I'm supposed to be.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Well,
I mean, you wrote another really fun book. What is it called? About the
Bird's Eye? Or
no, it's
Big
not,
Oyster?
No, not Big Oyster. The other book about sort of what food was like in this country before.
Oh, Food of Younger Land. Yeah.
Oh, I love that book. It's really because it's amazing how emotional food is and how it's such a cornerstone of a culture, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, the response to that book. I mean, it was tremendous. It was on the bestseller list. And, that was a book that I did just because I found this archive that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted people to know about it, that the WPA had collected all this food writing to do a book that they never did, and it just ended up being dumped in boxes. And I thought, this would be really interesting to look at. And, the boxes were at the Library of Congress, and you open them up, and they're, carbon copies on onion skin, and it's just it's like finding a time capsule.
Right. And somehow you sift through all that and come up with a book. I mean, most of us are playing tennis, and you're coming up with this awesome book. I travel this country a lot as a stand-up comic, and I talk about food a lot on this podcast. I had to start investigating how to eat to keep my energy going, so I've had a lot of food gurus, food scientists, and fitness guys who talk about food. Everybody's got their own orthodoxy. You've got vegans. But one of the things that I always say is that if Americans learned how to eat, if we went back to the way we used to eat with real ingredients that we grow in soil, my feeling is that our healthcare crisis wouldn't even be on the political agenda. I just think that it starts.
It's also cultural. If people went back to the local culture that this food comes from. I mean, I remember when I was a kid. In the 1950s, and there weren't highways, and everywhere you went, the food was different, and it was local. And I travel around the U.S. a lot, also doing book readings and things like that. And there's a lot of parts of the country where it's very hard, unless you really know the place, know people, to find food.
Yeah, of course it is.
Well, and that's what so much of your writing is about, too, is essentially like when people had difficulty finding food. That's what cod's about, right? When, it's very hard to find a protein source, and the nice thing about cod was that you could store it. And also, you have that book, Bird's Eye, which is basically about the invention of bird's eye foods, or the invention of frozen foods. Like, so much of what Brian's dealing with is he has infinite choice in terms of what food he can eat. And so then how does he pick and choose the smorgasbord for, maintaining his energy? Yeah.
The interesting thing about the bird's eye story was, this was this basically 19th century man born in the 1880s, lived in the first half of the 20th century. But, he grew up in the Industrial Revolution, and he thought industry was wonderful. Mm-hmm. And he thought that industry would make everything wonderful, including food. And his goal was to industrialize food.
His wish came
true.
true.
Foodie's nightmare.
Yeah, it certainly is.
But he, he loved food, and he really felt that he was doing wonderful things. And in some ways he was. I mean, he was making food more available. Mm-hmm. But the context of the times make things look very different. And he lived in a time. We talk now about locavores, and like you were saying, just going back to what grows in the earth locally.
Right.
Well, that's all Clarence Birdseye had when he was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
He thought, wouldn't it be great if he had factories producing this food that you could get anywhere?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say it's all fine and dandy to be an organic farmer living off the land until you can't get your strawberries or melon but 1 month a year. Isn't it true? I mean, it seems that there's always this sort of nostalgia to go back to the land and go back to what it was back in the day. Back in the day, a lot of people went hungry and didn't get a whole lot of variety.
Well, you see that in food for younger land, that,
Yeah.
in the winter months, I mean, everybody's eating canned food and really basic stuff. And
Yeah.
we're eating much better in the winter than we used to because we can fly things in from other places and other seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And now we get, some fruit in the winter time from the southern hemisphere. And, not all of that is a bad thing. But it's, we tend to value what we're not getting.
Right.
Yeah.
I always think about my father. My father grew up in Boston, and his father was a tailor. And his father, my grandfather, made all his clothes. And his dream was to someday have a factory-made suit.
Wow. Wow. That's great. Yeah. Yeah. I always say it's funny because people always talk about, technology is a wonderful thing. Somebody said, well, if you really want to go back to the old days, would you rather live before anesthesia or after anesthesia? Let's just start with that question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right.
Or vaccines before the children would just fall dead of fevers, etc. Diphtheria would roll through a town and take out, 30 kids or something, right?
Right.
So
And one of the interesting things about Birdseye, actually, I'm working on a book for kids about Birdseye because, look at Birdseye's time, and it has a lot in common with today. I mean, constant new life-changing inventions all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, kids just love this stuff, and adults went around saying, uh-oh, I don't know where this is leading. It was very much like our time.
Mm.
And people today say, the world is really changing. And it is, but, the world changing is not a new thing.
No, it's not. And it seems to me that, if you read the book Cod, you read the book Salt, Cod's such an infamous fish, just in the sense that you talk about not only did it provide protein for expeditions for military expansion, countries to kind of feed their armies as they went in and took over other countries, etc., but it also was very instrumental in keeping the slave trade alive in the Caribbean. And by the way, from what I've read in history, if you were a black slave, if you were an African slave, you didn't want to be dropped off in the Caribbean. Take the United States, England, or anywhere else but the Caribbean because it sucked.
Yeah.
As if it didn't suck anywhere else, of course. But
sugar plantations were pretty bad. Although,
yeah.
Being a slave on an American cotton plantation wasn't that great either.
No,
it wasn't a picnic.
It wasn't a picnic either, for sure.
But when you're choosing between two layers of hell,
that's right. But Cod kept that.
The deal is you don't want to have that choice.
That's right. That's right. And by the way, though, Cod kept that industry going. And the larger point that I'm making is that it really seems that human beings, the through line of history is human beings seem to be. We seem to be constantly be pushing ourselves beyond our biology. It seems that the man's quest, if there was one through line, and tell me if you agree with this, is for immortality. Whether back in the day you figured out a way to sort of push your point of view, your culture, and your influence overseas to another country so you could take them over. You did that, and you had to figure out a way to feed your army and your horses. And now technology seems to be pushing us to sort of to the point where we are, really getting to the point where we're going to mesh our bodies with synthetic machines that are biocompatible, that end up, doing all kinds of stuff where we'll live
There is an inherent desire in human beings to push past whatever limitations are there. And, biologists will say that this is in our DNA. This is something that evolved in evolution, this urge to push past limits that has driven us to constantly do these new things. as you were saying, some of which are good and some of which aren't.
Right.
And that's I think what's so interesting is that, you know, it's like that's a big idea and it's hard to appreciate. And I think what's so great about your books is that you Robert McKee, who's like the famous screenwriting guru, he always talks about what a great movie does is it takes a tiny piece of the world and it shows it in all directions, right? You just keep on looking at that one tiny piece, and as you do that, you see the whole world reflected.
Right.
And I think that's what your books, the microhistory genre that you basically invented, does so well. Is it by looking at cod and looking at really closely all the sides of cod, or looking really closely at, you know, salt and all the sides of salt, you can see all of human nature and all of human history reflected, because, you know, we are trying to push beyond our boundaries, which creates a problem. We don't have a protein source, so we find cod. But then as we do that, we overexploit cod and destroy those cod stocks, which then creates a new problem. And that's, you really get a feel for the shape of human history through that story or through any of your stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just happens to be the way in which my mind works. I mean, some people tend to look at a big thing and narrow it down.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to look at a small thing and expand it.
Mm.
Wow, that's
not
it. That's
that one way is right and the other way is wrong. It's just, you know, it just happens to be how I think.
Well, it's very accessible.
Yeah.
I prefer the way you think. It seems to be way more accessible. And this brings us to your book that drops today, July 11th. Tell us a little bit about this, because you take a song, a Marvin Gaye song, Dancing in the Street, and you talk about its significance and how important that song was in how it sparked movements, etc. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, the book's called Ready for a Brand New Beat, which is, you know, kind of the song. I think that the song, by looking at this song and the history of this song, you can learn a lot about what happened to popular music in this country and the kind of cross-pollination between black movements and the emergence of black music.
Mm.
This song is a particularly good example of that. And,
Why is that?
well, because it came out in the summer of 1964. A Motown song written by Marvin Gaye, Mickey Stevenson, and Ivy Jo Hunter, and sung by Martha and the Vandellas. And the summer of 1964 was an unusual moment in history. So many things happened that summer, including the first of what came to be known as race riots was in Harlem just before the song came out.
And right before that, 63, I think, where the showdown in Birmingham, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was the summer of the Mississippi Freedom Summer,
Mm-hmm.
which was a huge program of the civil rights movement, registered voters in Mississippi. And it was also the summer that the Vietnam War began. Just a lot of things came together that summer. And here is this song, which ostensibly is a song about dancing and having a good time. Except that there is a very old tradition in black music called masking, in which you have the upbeat meaning for people who want that, and then you have darker meaning, the political meaning.
And they used to do that a lot on the slave plantations, right?
I don't know anything about that.
It went back to slave times. A lot of songs about escaping to the north, like "Follow the Drinking Gourd," which was the Big Dipper, and you follow the Big Dipper, you head north. A lot of songs like that.
And this is called masking.
Yes.
I don't know anything about that. That's fascinating to me. I love that.
It's a very strong tradition of black music. That in 1964, white people were only just beginning to think about, with songs like Louie Louie, which I remember as a kid. You figure out what the words meant. And, so was the FBI, actually. And,
oh, really?
Yeah, we were both doing the same thing, playing the record really slowly to try to figure out what the words were.
That's like with the Led Zeppelin thing, where you play it backwards because it had supposedly all this hidden satanic meaning in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Or syncing up Pink Floyd with the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But in 1960, this was kind of new thinking for white people, but for black people, this has been going on forever.
Right.
So here's this song, and it says, "Calling out around the world, are you ready for a new beat? Summer's here, and the time is right for dancing in the streets." Well, at a time when everybody is dreading every summer, is this going to be a long, hot summer, they would say, a summer of insurrections in black neighborhoods. And this became a kind of an anthem, in Chicago and New Orleans. They're all towns that had very strong black communities.
So in a way, Marvin Gaye was and the other writers you mentioned were writing very deliberately. It was a song of protest. It was a call to action, but with the euphemisms, euphemistically saying "dancing in the street." The time is now, and so many people have covered this song. Yeah.
Or if you want, it's just a party song.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of up to you.
I like it. You can dance and punch somebody in the face at the same time. It's kind of cool.
I believe Justin Bieber does a similar thing with his music. There's some really deep social protests going on underneath.
Yeah. Well, Mark, we do live in a time where it doesn't seem like the stakes are as high. I mean, in your book, 1968, you call that, I think, very controversially, by the way, the most important year of the 20th century. I think you say something to that effect. Right, and now there's 1914, there's 1918, there's 1941, there's 1939. There are a lot of years. There's 1848. There are a lot of years that you could take. But
the extraordinary thing about 1968 was that this kind of eruption, very similar, happened all over the world at a time where there wasn't an internet, there wasn't people weren't even making long-distance phone calls very much.
Right.
But it just kind of spontaneously happened, and it was very similar, in Europe and in Latin America and in Asia and everywhere in the world.
Much like the Arab Spring or 1848, which Bryan is talking about.
I'll tell you something interesting about the Arab Spring. Somebody called me at the height of... No, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Arab Spring. It was the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Right.
At the height of the Occupy Wall Street movement, I think it was the BBC, called me, and they were trying to get me to say, well, this is like 1968 all over again. And I kept saying, well, we'll see. We'll have to wait and see.
Exactly.
There's a big difference between Occupy Wall Street, which is, a hipster convention, and 1968, where the Czechs were staring down Soviet tanks. Yeah. Like, they're not quite the same.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so many things happen.
It could have developed into, theoretically, it could have developed into the same kind of thing, but it didn't. And, it's not likely to, because in 1968, there were so many factors that came together to make that year what it was, that it just seems unlikely that you would have the same combination ever again.
Well, I think what 1968 had that Occupy Wall Street didn't have was clarity. Like, whether you're talking about the civil rights movement or you're talking about, the Prague Spring or you're talking about what was going on in Paris, they knew what they were fighting against. And to some extent, they knew what they were fighting for. Occupy Wall Street they don't have the same clear agenda, I don't think.
The enemy was more amorphous, it seems.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what else they didn't have? I actually brought this up in Ready for a Brand New Beat. They didn't have any songs.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. There wasn't one song they could. Right.
That sounds silly at first, but all great movements have songs. The civil rights movement was full of songs. The 60s had all these songs like Dancing in the Street and all these other songs. And
the Civil War had lots of songs. I mean, that's
the American Revolution did.
Yeah.
There were no songs to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and that was the first indication that there was something missing there.
I never would have thought of that. I never would have thought of that about how important that is, because music and song is so unifying. But isn't that a reflection in some ways of the idea that we are living in cynical times? We are not living in idealistic times. I mean, there were people, it seems, the music that came out of the 60s and 68, that Renaissance, I think that was the year of the Haight-Ashbury. Was that Monterey? Wasn't that the Monterey? It was somewhere around there. But
the Monterey Festival was earlier.
Okay, but the idea, the music that was coming out then, those musicians really believed in some ways that they were changing the world, or at least they were being heard when they screamed into their microphone. There was this idea, this wonderfully naive notion that they were, and maybe it wasn't so naive, by the way.
There was also this thing which I write about a lot in Ready for a Brand New Beat, that this generation, my generation, for the first time, we had our own music. And a huge multi-million-dollar music industry that was aimed at us. Mm-hmm. The reason for that was that they had developed transistors, and so music became portable.
Oh wow!
And we could go off. I could go off with other kids and listen to music. Previous generations. When they listened to music, they sat in the living room with the family listening to music. The music industry was geared towards that family.
Well, it's also come back to now where music is very personal. There's you listen to it on your earphones. Nobody else can hear it. You're in your own little world. Whereas back then you had to share it with a boombox or whatever it was.
Right. But the big change that came about in the 50s and 60s was that kids didn't have to listen to music with adults, so they could go off and have their own music. They could listen to it in cars, and so music became the expression for a rebellion that was going on, and that this whole notion of crossover music, black music for white people, R&B music, which when white people performed it was called rock and roll, but it was basically black music.
Right.
Guy like Elvis Presley,
Oh yeah, his influences were all black. I mean,
he was one of many people, Southern guys who were rebellious enough to go to the wrong side of town and listen to the black music.
Mm-hmm. And the large.
I mean, Zeppelin's heroes.
This was all part of the whole concept of integration.
Right.
So you have somebody like Barry Gordy and Motown, which tries really hard to be apolitical, except that they are producing black music for white people, something that had never happened before.
Right.
And it was an unconscious connection to the civil rights movement.
That's so interesting because, and by the way, I always tell young people, Led Zeppelin, the Stones, their heroes were people like Muddy Waters and the great blues and rhythm and blues artists, the guys that you don't hear about. There's a great documentary. It
all comes out of blues. From blues, there was rhythm and blues, which was rock and roll, and even the Brits. I mean, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all those groups are so consciously influenced by the blues.
They're almost plagiarizing. It's so funny because you hear them talk like this. They talk like this. They're from England and they speak in this sort of like the Queen's English. And then when they sing, they're baby, and all of a sudden my mother would always say, "Why are they singing in these sort of like Southern accents?"
Absolutely. And falsetto. How many Beatles songs slide into falsetto?
Right.
It's a complete black R&B convention. White people didn't do that.
That's right. Stanley Crouch, I think, said something like the American character is essentially a biracial character. We owe a great deal of gratitude to that 12% that is African American. I think he's 100% right. I mean, just the origins of jazz.
Absolutely. Or as Amira Baraka once put it, any white guy with any brains knows enough to steal from black people.
Yeah, amen. That you have a wonderful quote, and I don't know what book it was. It's an Ezra Pound quote, and I'm going to try to remember it. And she says something to the effect of, one of the joys of middle age is looking back at my youth and realizing that I was right about a lot of things when I was 17 or say 23.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing. I love Ezra Pound for saying that. As you get older, you realize that so much of how you felt, those deep-seated feelings, those notions that song made you profoundly sad and inspired at the same time, or whatever it might be, a movie that, my God, I became an actor because I saw Raging Bull and I wanted to change the world. I thought me as an actor, I thought I really mattered. And
well, I have to say that, when I was in college in the 60s, people kept saying, when you get older, you'll see things very differently.
Uh-huh.
I'm still waiting for that to happen.
I love that about you, Mark Kurlansky. That's what I love about your books. You have retained your astonishment at the world, and in many ways, I suppose, probably your outrage at the injustices of the world. That to me is what makes you somewhat heroic. It's what makes you so inspiring. It's why your books should be read. That at your age, I think you're 64 now. You still have that raw, rusty passion that someone who's naive enough at 25 to believe they can really make a difference and change the world. You sit around writing books in the ether, and I'm sure that every time you do it, it's somewhat of an act of faith. This idea is, anybody read this frickin' thing? But you keep doing it, and thank God they do keep reading it. So,
the part of life, when I was younger, I used to pick up a newspaper, and today I'm more on a screen. But every morning, I'm doing something to look and see what's happening in the world, and I just get completely pissed off.
Yeah. Well, why do you get pissed off? Is it give me the source of what you're pissed off about, and if I may, you don't have to answer the question because maybe there's no answer, but if you could change 5 things, what would they be?
Well, you know what really pisses me off is that there's just the best word for it is bullshit. There's just so much bullshit that goes down.
Yep.
For example, so the Supreme Court guts the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
Yes.
Now, why does this happen? It doesn't happen because the Supreme Court is racist. It happens because half of the Supreme Court were nominated by Republicans, are sympathetic to Republicans, and black people don't vote for Republicans, and so Republicans have been plotting more and more to keep black people from voting.
Wow. That's
a strong claim.
That's a strong claim. Wow. Huh.
And, just take a look at district gerrymandering and all of the things that go on.
Sure.
I
think Republicans are having to sort of come to terms with the fact that this country is becoming browner and browner, and if they want to stay relevant, they've got to start taking these issues on at face value and actually embracing people of color as opposed to trying to gerrymander.
Absolutely. Instead of trying to figure out how to have more white districts and how to keep black people at home on election day, they ought to figure out what it is that black people want that they're not offering.
I think they'll find, much to their surprise, that black people want very much the same things that white people want: a better future for their kids, individual representation, good education, et cetera, et cetera.
The same thing that the majority of decent people around the world want. Like, if we set aside the nut job 1%, right? Yeah. Like 99% of people just want a good life.
Yeah.
And the chances.
Yeah, but the question is the question in politics is, who are they going to turn to for that? Who are they going to believe is most likely to deliver that? And that's who you vote for.
But I think I think part of the problem is there are the failings of the Republicans and there are the failings of the Democrats. I think increasingly we're at a stage where we don't really feel like we can believe in either of them, that they're both bullshit.
Well, they are.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lawrence
Lessig.
Another thing that's driving me crazy right now is the Obama administration hunting down this guy who,
Snowden,
the NSA guy.
Yeah, who revealed all of this spying that they were doing. So instead of talking about why are they spying on us, they're trying to prosecute this guy for spying.
That's right.
I mean, that is so completely flipped around.
It sure is. Nobody's asking, why is the NSA collecting information on American citizens? Why should I trust the NSA? Well, I don't. What of me? I don't trust them. I don't trust a government agency. I don't believe that, yes, there's a nest. The NSA is a big ear and they're necessary. I don't think that should happen independently. I think that if they want to collect information on American citizens, how about something called a court order?
Right, but what's happening is that the public dialogue is very little about that, and it's largely about where is this guy Snowden and why did he go to China and why did he go to Russia? And
yeah, it's like a mystery. It's like a mystery tale. It's like a mystery. It's like a mystery novel now. Instead of we're not dealing with the principles and the ideas behind what this guy did and why and we're not taking the NSA to task. Right.
Right.
Well, but that's also because that's a much better story. Like, people like spy novels. Like, that's much more interesting than some sort of discussion.
Yeah, you could do a good novel about the government spying on us. I mean, 1984 worked well.
Yeah, well,
it sure did.
Well, but I
think Mark's got a new book. Careful, guys. He'll write one out in 3 days. This guy, 25 books is the craziest thing in the world. It's just unbelievable. I can't wait to read this new book. I can't wait.
Well, it's a fun book, especially if you're into music.
Yeah,
but it's really about the power of music and
But Mark,
the power of a song. What makes a song endure? Why is it that this song, almost 50 years later, is still heard all of the time, and still has meaning to people, in spite of the fact that everybody's always argued about what it means?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting.
Well, and that's the interesting thing too, is that a lot of these great songs, it's the same thing as a great poem. Like when you read Shakespeare, right? You can analyze a monologue in Shakespeare dozens and dozens and dozens of ways. Like really, really great writing, you can just keep on throwing your mind against it and trying to get it to give up its secrets.
Right.
Whereas something that you understand right away isn't worth your time.
Right.
Well, Mark, talk to us a little bit about, we are living in challenging times. I think that the enemy is a little more amorphous. It's a little more insidious. You don't see him as clearly. What's your advice to young people, man? I mean, you are a man who writes about the great turning points in history, 1968, and the power of nonviolent protest, the power of song, the power of getting out in the streets. You do that so eloquently. Is there something, if you had a bullhorn, if you could get into the ear of at least the American youth, what would you say to them?
You do have a bullhorn. It's the Bryan Callen Show.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, the Bryan Callen Show. Yeah.
Okay, here it is. Cynicism gets you nothing. Everything that has been accomplished in human history has been accomplished by people who believe they change things and operated from a position of idealism.
Wow.
And I think, Bryan talked to Christy Wampole, who...
Christy Wampole a Princeton professor, and she wrote a book, an article in the New York Times called How to Live Without Irony. I don't know if you read it, Mark.
How to live without what?
Without irony. And she kind of she just talks about this collective misstep where our youth doesn't feel like there's this sort of idea of failing before you even try anything. Well, what's the point of anything? I'm going to be so hip that I'm going to wear retro clothing that I don't even remember or nothing has any meaning. It's all about sort of not committing to anything. Political commitment is so gauche, and so is any kind of commitment.
I have a 12-year-old daughter, and I see that with her friends. I mean, they don't believe they can have any impact on anything, that they can have any voice, and they can. Young people have so much power.
Yes. But they need to know what the enemy is. In Lawrence Lessig's book, Republic Lost, that Hunter and I talk about a lot, he says the only thing to think about, he quotes Thoreau, and Thoreau says, I see man everywhere hacking at the branches of evil while none are hitting the root. And he says the only thing you should be talking about in this country, if you want to change the political system, you want to change things, it's about campaign finance reform. You've got to figure out a way to get money out of politics. When politicians are spending 40% of their time calling people they don't know no for money. When fundraisers are actually the people running our democracy, we have lost our republic. Now, that might be a little dramatic, but...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And while I'm at it, I wish the Democratic Party would stop calling me.
So what's that? Would stop calling what?
Stop calling me. They call me for money 4 times a week.
Listen, man, when you have international bestsellers, my friend, you got to wet everybody's beak.
And listen, now that they know that the 25th book is coming out, you can guarantee that,
Yeah, Kurlansky, that wealthy as hell writer.
Yeah.
The guy who made a lot of money writing histories about salt, cod, and oysters and frozen food. Come on, spread the wealth, brother.
But I agree with you. It's the way our political system is set up, where it's just all about raising money, is just horrendous.
Yeah.
Because they don't have the time to govern. They don't have the time to figure out, what would a good healthcare system
but
look
there's
like.
Never been the concentration of corporate power is unprecedented. Where Campbell's Soup controls 70% of the shelf space for all soups, etc., etc. You got 4 pharmaceutical companies that essentially control everything to do with drugs and have very strong lobbying efforts. When Wall Street can pool their resources and break down the Glass-Steagall Act, etc., etc. How do you fight behemoths
and
like
it's not,
that?
And it's also the behemoths that are the unions. I mean, across the board,
Absolutely.
it's that's the point. Is just that
and how many good ideas get thrown away because they won't fly with the money people?
Yeah,
there you go. But that's where I suppose people like you, and even in a very small way, my podcast, you've just got to keep talking about it and get young people aware of what the problem is to begin with.
And I think the first problem, actually, even before you get to campaign finance, is that irony. It's the unwillingness to care. You have to be willing to put what Mark's saying, you have to be willing to put your ass on the line, really say, I stand for something, I believe in certain things.
Yes, but Mark, don't you think a lot of that has the fact that people don't move as much is because we're all so well fed that bringing back to food? I mean, the Soviet Revolution happened because people got so tired of waiting in line for bread. This country doesn't have that problem.
Well, if you really look at history, revolutions are made by the middle class.
Really?
Yeah.
They rally the poor, but the revolutionaries are middle class people.
Lenin was a college student. You know what I mean?
I suppose so.
Yeah.
So were the founding fathers.
Look at the people of the American Revolution, one of the more commercial revolutions, actually. But in 1968, I mean, one of the things that created the 60s was a generation that had never known an economic recession.
Mm-hmm.
Constant increase in economic growth year after year.
Because that's what
produced a generation with a tremendous amount of confidence.
Wow.
And a willingness to look at their discontents. I mean, Betty Friedan, when she wrote The Feminine Mystique, right? I mean, that's the thing. That she was really talking about housewives. And part of the reason why she was able to, come up with that book and figure that out is because she was sitting home, bored out of her day, bored out of her mind at home, scrubbing, cooking, cleaning, doing all of that sort of stuff.
Wow.
You need that time
there
to...
There were all these articles in the 60s about leisure time.
Yeah.
And how this was a huge problem. What are we going to do with all our leisure time?
Amazing.
And we
know spark a protest.
Yeah.
I just thought of that, Mark. I mean, you're right. The founding fathers, a lot of them were lawyers, and they were essentially middle class
or upper
businessmen,
middle class,
right?
yeah.
Or upper middle class.
Yeah, most of the youth leaders of the 60s were middle class people. In fact, the Port Huron statement that the SDS wrote begins, "We of the middle class."
Wow.
Yeah, and it's always, I mean, that's the thing. The real danger that you get into is when you don't have a strong middle class. There's I can't remember who it is, but
and the downturns in the economy and the kind of frightening things, the frightening unpredictable turns that have happened in recent years have tended to make people, and especially young people, less courageous, more scared.
Do you find when you're working on a book, Mark, and something like 2007, the financial crisis happens, do you find yourself having to figure out what the root of that problem is? Does it throw your work off? Do you become sort of a what's the word? Forensic scientist, and sort of, do you freak out and say, I got to figure out why this happened? Do you have a point of view on that?
On economic downturns like that?
Yeah, like why? I mean, who? I mean, do you have a strong point of view on who's to blame for that? Was it just a large phenomenon? Have you read a lot about that? I mean, a guy with your mind who writes these books and is obsessed with the notion of
that particular downturn, as well as the Great Depression in 1929 and the 30s, were caused by big money doing highly speculative things that the bottom fell out from.
It's being able to. It's a gambler where you just keep on giving the gambler more and more and more money. They're just going to get themselves deeper in the hole until they can't pay back.
But they could.
It's interesting because that lesson was learned from the Depression, and that's why there were all of these regulations, and then there was this movement away from regulation, and we paid for it.
Yeah, we did pay for it. I just feel as though the great irony and the great hypocrisy of Wall Street is that they're always talking about free markets. They don't live in a free market. They don't live in a free market. They are socialist enterprises. They have socialized risk and privatized gains. That's a fact. And you see it all the time. I wish they'd put their money where their mouth is. They call Obama a socialist. Wall Street, why don't you guys compete in the real marketplace? Let's see you compete, because what would have happened is you guys would have all gone broke, including Goldman Sachs, and just like Lehman Brothers did. That's where the hypocrisy. I can't stand hypocrisy. That's what drives me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing about calling Obama a socialist. I mean, first of all, it's an old, outdated kind of politics where you can just label somebody a socialist and then they're in trouble,
Yes.
Yeah.
I wish he was more of a socialist. I mean, he's not much of a socialist.
Do you find yourself more left leaning as you study history and things, or are you a free market guy? Where do you stand? Libertarian?
I have never, I have never had much faith in capitalism.
The hesitation there is particularly enjoyable.
I never had much faith in. Problem is, I
was trying to think of what would be the clearest way to put it.
Right.
This notion that what's good for Wall Street is good for the world.
Well, I think
it's just silly. They're not trying to be good for the world.
Well,
I spent a lot of years writing about the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean, the idea of capitalism doesn't have a lot of currency. And Eric Williams, who was the founding father of Trinidad, was once asked about this, and he said, "Well, we don't feel good about capitalism because we used to be the capital."
That's funny. But capitalism really is about private property, isn't it? I mean, isn't that a cornerstone of just part of what the founding fathers were talking about? I mean, the idea that you have a right to your own private property and a right to profit from your own ingenuity and your own risk and your own effort.
Yeah, look, I think that in history, lots of ideas come along, and we should look at all of them, and we should have a mixed system that borrows from I don't like dogmatic anything.
Right.
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 I think one of the great mistakes is that people don't look at the communist world this way, see what worked and what didn't, because some things did and other things didn't, and it was like a laboratory.
Right.
Or if you ask the question, what should government do? What is government good at? You look at these countries and you see, well, they're good for education and they're good for health care. They're really bad at restaurants. They're not so good for art and culture.
Freedom of speech.
Yeah.
You get you start getting ideas for what things work and what things don't work.
Sure.
Well,
you need government for certain. This country was founded on lots of federal efforts, and they did some things very well and some things very poorly. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and any position which includes other positions is in trouble. Like that's the problem with libertarianism. I mean, I can sympathize with the idea of too much government control and getting government out of things, but I also agree with Alexander Hamilton, who said if men were angels, we wouldn't need government.
Yeah, that's right, man. Very well put. I find the libertarian, the Cato Institute, which I listen, I go to their website and stuff. But it is they fall into the trap of being ideologues themselves. I mean, they're just too extreme to some extent. It's not practical.
But
right?
that's so much of it is that. Well, I mean, FDR, for example, had no problem borrowing from the socialists and the communists and even from the fascists. Like that's he was really very much like Deng Xiaoping said, right? It doesn't matter if the cat is white or if it's black, so long as it catches mice.
I just like that he quoted Deng Xiaoping. You see what you deal with, Mark? When you come on the Bryan Callen Show, this is lofty stuff, my friend.
I got to say, I wasn't ready for a Deng Xiaoping.
You're never ready for a Deng Xiaoping.
Nobody's ready for a Deng Xiaoping.
It's kind of like how you never expect the Spanish Inquisition.
Right.
There it is. Mark, I want to thank you for, this has just been such a treat, man. And you bring a pedigree to my podcast that I don't deserve. And I just hope one day I can repay the favor. Come out to one of my I promise you, come out to my stand-up if you're, I don't know, where do you live most of the time?
In New York City.
I will be in New York City. I'll be performing at Gotham Comedy Club. I don't know when yet, but I'll let you know. You will learn nothing, but I promise you'll laugh your ass off for an hour and 10 minutes, or money back.
Well, I appreciate that opportunity to escape from learning.
I can imagine when you're writing 25 books. And the book for you guys to buy is Ready for a Brand New Beat by Mark Kurlansky, author of 25 books. And I am sure, without a doubt, it's as good as all his other books. I found Cod and Salt in 1968 to be just fantastic. So thanks for what you do. I think you make the world a better place, Mark. So,
well, thank you. I don't know that that's true, but it would be nice if it were.
Well, it sounds good, though, doesn't it? It sounds good, pal. Now you can quote me. Bryan Callen, who? He's that sometimes working actor. But anyway, he was in The Hangover and The Hangover 2. Anyway, he said, so there it is. My friend, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. And you're welcome back anytime.
Enjoy talking to you.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.
Take care. That's
Mark Kurlansky right there. That's exciting. I hope you guys learned something, because I did. And his books are great, man. That's just a lot of fun to do. I was a little nervous trying to keep up with him and trying to figure out. I didn't want to bore him with dumb questions.
Well, I also liked where he was like, the communist world has a lot of interesting ideas. Like, he clearly just wanted to go to a certain place, but
right. I was all tight. I was like, hold on, I don't like communists. I'm a libertarian, damn it. What's funny is that when you talk to somebody who spends that much time thinking and writing and taking positions, you can't help but to learn and reevaluate your point of view.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so interesting about Mark is that his interests are so broad.
Yeah.
And then that gives you such a problem because there's so much information, and then how do you make sense of it?
That's right. That's exactly right.
By
the way, everybody, just so you know, my stand-up dates, I will be in Brea at the Brea Improv. I think it's July 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st. And then I'll be at the Chicago Improv in Schaumburg, Illinois, the 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th. Come out in force. I will make you laugh. I'm doing all new stuff. And a shout out to my peeps in Fort Lauderdale. Man, oh man, I don't know what they put in the water. Maybe it's in the air. Those people come to scream and laugh, and they stand in line for pictures, and I love them because they make me feel like a mini rock star. All right, Hunter Motz.
So, Schaumburg, Illinois.
Yes.
Know that you got a step.
That's right. Hunter Motz, thanks for making my podcast so much better. His book that he wrote with Katie O'Brien is called The Straight A Conspiracy. you should read it, especially if you have kids in high school, about to go to high school, kids in general. And if you're a kid in high school, tell us a little bit about, really quickly, you were talking about a neuroscientist who, I think at UCLA, who really liked it. And
yeah, I mean, our book's being reviewed by Barbara Vickery, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA. It's also being reviewed by Steve Marks, who was one of New York Magazine's top neuroscientists.
Wow.
So, you know, I mean, that's the thing. We really made sure that, like, the scientific community would be absolutely behind everything that we said, and, you know, that was...
And you said what, in a nutshell?
That the idea that people are born smart is the worst idea ever.
It's the worst idea ever, because human potential is basically how you approach something.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that your brain is so flexible that you can handle any environment. That's how we've been able to survive in the frozen wastelands of the north, the Amazon rainforest, the deserts of the Sahara, and that's how whatever, you know, happens in the workforce, whatever happens in school, whatever's thrown at you, you can adapt to that. Like, we are the species that can adapt to anything. So the idea that you can't learn algebra or that you can't learn a foreign language is utterly ridiculous. And you have to get rid of that idea, because that's what gets in the way of you being excellent.
There you go. That means I can win an Oscar and I can be Brendan Schaub in a fight. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's the Bryan Callen Show. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to The Bryan Callen Show. Be sure to visit bryancallen.com for information about this episode as well as past and future episodes. You can follow Bryan on Twitter at Bryan Callen and like him on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/Bryan Callen Comedy. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.